Well, welcome to Don't Know Much About, where everything as you know, starts with a question. On Don't Know Much About, I bring guests to look back at the past so we can better understand what's happening right now. We talk history, personal stories, and ideas to help make sense of the world we're living in. Today's guest is especially meaningful to me for two reasons. First, he was my dissertation advisor when I was writing my PhD thesis. Second, his research focused largely on Soviet Jewry is especially relevant right now. As conversations about contemporary anti-Zionism grow, many people are tracing its genealogy back to the Soviet state, writing about refuseniks and the such. I'd like to therefore invite Marat to participate in this discussion here today. We'll get into that shortly, but before we do, I'd like to properly introduce my guest for you all today. So, Professor Marat Grinberg immigrated to the United States of America from Ukraine in 1993. He graduated from the joint degree program between the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, of America and Columbia University in New York City in 1999 and received his PhD in comparative literature from the University of Chicago in 2006. His work focuses on Jewish literature and cinema, Soviet and Eastern European Jewish culture, and 20th century Russian literature. Marat is currently a professor of Russian and humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. He's a prolific author and public intellectual. Among his books are I am to be read not from left to right, but in Jewish, from right to left. The Poetics of Boris Slutsky. That came out in the year 2011. And most recently, the widely acclaimed The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines, that came out in 2023. And I have it with me today. This is really going to be our launching, where we're going to launch a launching pad to have this robust conversation about Soviet Jewry. Marat's essays have appeared in such national venues as Tablet Magazine, Jewish Journal of Los Angeles, Mosaic, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and he's currently working on a larger study of Jewishness and the Holocaust in Russian, Ukrainian, and Eastern European speculative fiction of the Soviet era. And I hope maybe we'll get a chance to discuss that as well. So I welcome Marat enthusiastically to my show. And as you can see, while Marat has written prolifically, our conversation today will focus predominantly on his latest book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, and most original rescue of Soviet Jewish life that can be best described as an investigation into the relationship between the Soviet Jewish readers and their bookcases. Now, as professor of literature, one might expect him to analyze or deconstruct individual literary texts. What is particularly original of this book is that Marat shifts the lens from text to reader, and in doing so, advances a really fascinating thesis. So, welcome, Marat, to this show. It's
Thank
a
you.
great honor.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to begin by getting straight to your thesis. What is the main discovery or argument, would you say, in your book? And then did you decide to look at books? Why did you do that? Why did you put that lens away from, let's say, doing a literary analysis to the analysis of the Soviet Jewish reader?
Yeah, thank you so much, Naya. First of all, it's just such a pleasure to be here with you. As you said, we've known each other a long time, and and I admire your work and everything that you're doing in Jewish education and wider. So it's wonderful to be here talking about my book. So what am I doing in this book? Let me start maybe from that's the image of Soviet Jewry, that has existed in the United States for decades, and I think still persists in kind of popular imagination, but also in some scholarly one as well. And that is so when I talk about this book, I start with a number of images, and one of them is Fiddler on the Roof, right? Fiddler on the Roof, something that's very familiar to American Jewish audience, part of American Jewish culture. And why I do that? Because, the kind of Soviet Jewry is still associated in the mind of American Jews with kind of the old country, right? So it's part of the world, sort of fiddler on the roof. So that's one part. Another image that I show has to do with the project of rescuing Soviet Jews by American Jews, kind of let my people go, right? Which again, a huge part of kind of American Jewish identity, and not to discount its importance, but it very much kind of perceives Soviet Jews as victims, the oppressed, who needed to be rescued. And the third, I show an image, the cover of this very influential book written by Elie Wiesel, called The Jews of Silence. It comes out in the early 60s, 1962, where Wiesel, who goes to Moscow, he basically says that he sees the Jews there who are oppressed and who are yearning to rejoin, Judaism. I mean, he emphasizes kind of the religious component, and he says, they're Jews of silence. Then he twists it around and he said, well, also, who are the Jews of silence? The American Jews are also the Jews of silence because they're not doing anything actively to help their Soviet Jewish brethren. So these three components, which in some sense paradoxical, because on the one hand, it's sort of part of the old country, that old world. On the other hand, there's like this complete, oppression, erasure of everything and anything Jewish, and then this idea of Jews of silence, right? So what I'm arguing in this book is that this picture, this narrative, I hate that term, but let's use it. This narrative, this mythology, well, it certainly does have kind of accurate components. It is, I think, simplistic. It is erroneous, to a large extent, because the reality of Soviet Jewish history, and I particularly concentrated on the post-Holocaust, post-World War II, post-Stalinist period, was much richer. Of course, the Soviet Union, was an authoritarian state that was not where conditions for Jews and frankly for everybody else were not great. But at the same time, the Soviet Jews, first of all, they knew who they were. I mean, speaking, of course, we need to make generalizations, right? But they knew who they were. And they made attempts within this atmosphere where, because what I emphasize is that obviously, various kind of stages of Soviet anti-Semitism. But what was really interesting about the Soviet Union when it came to Jews is that there was no public space for expressing one Jewishness, right? So then, how do you do that, right? How do you do that? And what I'm interested in is how these Soviet Jews maintained their Jewish identity, learned about, what it means to be a Jew. Jews within this atmosphere where one could not do that. And I think they actually came up, those Soviet Jews, among whom are counted my own parents and grandparents, your own, parents and grandparents, right? Came up with some pretty interesting imaginative ways of doing so. And so to answer that question, how they did that, I go to this idea of the bookshelf, right? Because you asked me about my argument. So at the core of my argument is the idea that we can speak about post-Stalinist Soviet Jewish history and culture really as a civilization, right? Fragmented civilization, existing again within this authoritarian, even perhaps totalitarian environment, but a civilization nevertheless. And if we're talking about civilization, we need to think about knowledge. Right. It's not enough to say that, I mean, Jews, they still remember that maybe, certain dishes were passed, from generation to generation or, just remains. No, we need to talk about knowledge. Right. And to talk about knowledge, we need to talk about books, right? So I look at the bookshelves that one would find in Soviet Jewish apartments across the Soviet Unions and ask what kind of books would one find there? And of course, one would find the classics of Russian literature. In other words, you would find the books that you would find in other apartments as well, non-Jewish ones. But the Jewish bookshelves also had special installments, right? Which consisted of translations from Yiddish, translations from German, anti-Zionist Soviet literature, interestingly enough, right? And so all of that kind of constitutes what I call essentially sort of the canon, the canon of Soviet of that post-Stalinist Soviet Jewish civilization. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me just for the viewers so, restate this another way. I think what you're saying is this work is in many ways working against sort of stereotypes of Soviet Jewish life, of this model of repression. And it's not that you're saying it wasn't repressive, absolutely, but what we miss when we just give this totalizing kind of picture of Soviet Jewish life is you miss that there was a civilization and there were Jews who what you're also saying here is that the Soviet Jewish bookshelf became a surrogate, almost little synagogue, if you will.
Absolutely.
And as I was reading this in preparation of with speaking with you, it just dawned on me how, you're right. How is it that my mother's Soviet Jewish bookshelf and my husband's parents' Soviet Jewish bookshelf and probably a myriad more um, Soviet Jewish bookshelves had the same texts, and what that meant. And I think what you're saying is that in a society, in a totalitarian society that does not allow Jews to engage in religious communal life, they find another way of engaging and creating a communal memory and communal life, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it is also, again, it's not unique. It's not unique to Soviet Jews because I think, ultimately we need to see the Soviet Jewish experience again, not just as a story, not just as a story of oppression, but as part of Jewish modernity, right? And this break with religion and finding new ways of figuring out what it means to be a Jew in the world and how to coexist with us. It's very much a part of Jewish modernity. And this in the Soviet Jewish case is again is very much a part of it. And I like how you put it that it's sort of these bookshelves are kind of this mini synagogue, right? Because we're not talking about the sacred canon,
No.
right? No, we're talking about sort of this a canon that consists of these diverse books. Again, there you would have translations of Sholem Aleichem into Russian. You would have translations of Leon Feuchtwanger, this German Jewish, historical novelist. You would have, specific works of Russian literature, often written by Jews, that touched either on pre-revolutionary Jewish life or the Holocaust. And again, you would have these books written very much from the kind of from the position of Marxism or specific Soviet policy, be it about Zionism, be it about Judaism, right? But these Soviet Jewish readers would read those books kind of what I call between the lines by crossing out the lines, right? To glean whatever information they could and sort of kind of putting all these fragments together, right? And I think there is a which is what I established, kind of the hierarchy within this bookshelf. What would be up front? What would be hidden deep, in the bookcase for a variety of reasons. And so again, there were huge differences, geographic, differences, generational differences, ethnic differences. Of course, Soviet Jews are not just Ashkenazi Jews, right? We can look at Central Asia. So, of course, there are differences, but at the same time, because we're dealing with an authoritarian state, which means that there is the same school curriculum across this enormous country, right? Uh, Not a single word can be published officially without the approval of the authorities, right? So because of that, it actually helps to recreate this unifying picture, right? Because when a 6 volumes collected works of Sholem Aleichem come out in the 1950s, if you're a Jew in Kiev or in Moscow or in Kamyanets-Podilsky, like my family, or in Moscow, you want to get those books, right? So precisely kind of this sort of authoritarian elements helps to recreate that picture. So it is very much, as I said, on the one hand, kind of part of this Jewish modernity and the patterns that we see across the board. Yeah, I often, when I talk about this book, American Jews would just come to sort of listen to my talk. They say, oh, I mean, that's recognizable to me. I also, had to put these different fragments together and sort of to create my own Jewish canon, Jewish identity. And at the same time, it is also, uniquely part of the context in which it existed.
Yeah, I have a quick question. You mentioned knowledge, and I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. Are you saying that because there was no access to sacred text, what these books, these secular books, largely functioned as almost encyclopedias for Jews to gain understanding of who they are? Is that what you meant by knowledge?
Yeah, great question, right? Well, I mean it in two ways. Sort of just empirical knowledge, right? Just knowing certain facts. And then, talking about reading as an experiential undertaking, right? So again, let's imagine, you're like I was, right? A schoolboy in a Soviet school, in Ukraine in the 1980s, yeah, or it could be 1970s, right? So you would go through the entire secondary school education from, first grade to 10th, and studying history, and the Soviet curriculum was pretty intense. You had an entire year devoted to ancient history, entire year devoted to medieval history, modern history. And not once would you just encounter the word Jew in those textbooks, right? So there's nothing. There is nothing. Then you would go on, to receive, your university degree, the same situation, right? So, but as a Jewish kid, again, growing up and knowing who you are, right? You want to know something, right? So where do you go to get that knowledge, right? If you look at these histories about Soviet Jews written, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, they state that this absence and they say, well, so erasure of, collective memory. And some of the books published today repeat that. Well, no, right? Because there were books on that bookcase. So one example that I have a whole chapter on it is Leon Feuchtwanger, and I know the writer who is important to you as well, right? Because of kind of the with knowledge that you received from your mom, right? So he was Leon Feuchtwanger, incredibly popular German Jewish novelist in the 1920s, 1930s, who then leaves Germany, when Hitler comes to power, eventually ends up in the United States, writes these massive historical novels, either dealing with, ancient history, medieval history, as well as the modern German history. And so he was, very popular and accepted as a classic in the Soviet Union because he was a man of the left. And so his books were published again, collected writings. And not only do his novels just have an absolutely unambiguous, explicit Jewish content, right? His trilogy about Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, his trilogy about his novel about Spanish Jewry, etc., etc. But at the end of those volumes, you had appendices, you had commentaries written by scholars, historians, translators that had to just provide information about all these Jewish, things that he talks about. A lot of that had to do, again, allusions to, to the Hebrew Bible or to the Talmud or to the holidays or to Jewish history, all of that, right? And there they were just presented as facts. Yeah. And so now, of course, not every single person reading, those volumes would be looking at appendices, but a lot would. Yeah. And so here was an opportunity to learn about Jewish history, to learn about Judaism through this writer, who, again, all of this is published officially. You don't need to go underground, right? So you're being sort of cautious as a Soviet citizen, right? As somebody who lives in this country and needs to survive and wants to do well. But on the other hand, you're also being subversive, right? Because then you're using that to learn something fundamental about yourself as a Jew. And that's why, I talk about kind of these personal tidbits in the book. My mom, right, you know, would give me, a volume of Feuchtwanger and say, you got to read it to understand what it means to be a Jew. And I was like 13, 14. And I read it then, and I don't think I fully comprehended what she meant. Now I fully comprehend, right? And I can't tell you how many times after giving talks about the book, I have, Soviet Jews now living in the United States of different generations coming up to me and saying, wow, that's exactly the experience that I had, right? Exactly. And I know, I think I quote actually you in the book, precisely talking about kind of that passing down that, that Feuchtwanger knowledge. And that's why it's so interesting. Let me just say this one thing. Again, we have a number of recollections about that when Soviet Jews who immigrated to Israel or immigrated to the United States, when they start talking about Feuchtwanger to their, American Jewish counterparts, to Israeli Jews, and the response is, who? Who are you talking about, right? I mean, Feuchtwanger's been, and so to them it's like unbelievable, right? Because in the Soviet context, Feuchtwanger, I call it kind of Soviet Jewish scripture. In the American Jewish context, he's simply unknown or known to very, very few. In the Israeli context, he's also it's just this, complete zero. And so here we're talking about this kind of this discrepancy, right?
Let's just slow down a little bit just because you know
Yeah,
so much about this, but maybe some of my listeners do not.
yeah, of
You
course.
almost preempted. I wanted to ask you, who is that seminal figure that sits on every single bookshelf? And it is the German Jewish writer Leon. Now, I pronounce it Feuchtwanger.
You pronounce it in the Russian like
Uh,
Feuchtwanger, it's
okay,
Feuchtwanger.
sorry,
Yeah.
Feuchtwanger.
Yeah.
And of course, it was my mother exactly who said to me, if you want to know Jewish history, if you want to know where Jewish people come from, you have to read in Russian Judейская война,
Yeah.
or in English Judean Wars, the Judean War about Josephus Flavius and the Roman conquest of Judea, a trilogy. Um, and you're absolutely right. When she told me about this, I was in high school. She said, you have to read it. She said, I'm going to find an English translation. I'm going to find one. And she did. Um, she also really loved Spanish the ballad.
Right.
Um, and so I want to really stress how extremely central this figure was for Soviet Jews. You're absolutely right. And how, when I talk about him to American Jewish counterpart, they have no clue. But I want to talk about him a little more because I found your chapter on him so fascinating. Yeah, you call him a man of the left. Yet there's a lot of Jewish nationalism in his works.
Absolutely.
And he met with Stalin. You write about this. Um, he basically got duped in many ways by Stalin. I don't know, maybe you agree or disagree. That I want to discuss that. But how do you, in a Soviet state where, Marxism is in direct conflict with nationalism, how does somebody like, Feuchtwanger get away with it? And how do Jews who are going to the book, they're not secretly doing it. The Soviet Union is, how is that? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah. Great questions, right? And again, I mean, it speaks to the sort of the paradoxes uh, of of this literary history of this, Soviet Jewish history, Soviet history. So as you mentioned, absolutely right. He comes to the Soviet Union in 1937. He's a, part of the wave of these, prominent Western intellectuals who are really kind of stuck between between these two tyrants, right? Hitler on the one hand, Stalin on the other hand, right? And a number of them opt for Stalin because obviously they see what is happening in Germany. And Feuchtwanger fits into that category. And these intellectuals were very much used by Stalin to present, this picture, Soviet Union to the world as actually, a free society that is in opposition to fascism. But it's really interesting. We now know because we now have his notes and kind of what he was actually thinking. He certainly had a much more sober view of Stalin than he described in the book that he writes after his visit Moscow in 1937, where he presents a very, very favorable picture of the Soviet Union. He attended a number of the show trials, which he says were actually sort of justice was enacted, and he was not forgiven for that by a number of figures, for instance, by Ilya Ehrenburg, another very, very important Soviet Jewish figure who just could not forgive him for, for that. But it's interesting in that book, Moscow 1937, he has a chapter devoted to Jews, right? And he talks about Soviet Jews and he talks about Birobidzhan. And again, it's certainly propagandist, but he very much kind of presents Soviet Jews as these healthy nationalists, yeah, who are very much in touch with who they are, who know who they are. And again, Feuchtwanger kind of posits the Soviet Union as this alternative to what is happening in Nazi Germany. And then he says in a piece that he writes, and it's published officially, he says that I'm now in the midst of finishing this trilogy about Josephus. And Josephus is fascinating because on the one hand, he's a traitor, right? He betrays his people, switches to the Roman side, and writes, Judean War, which is very favorable toward Rome. Yeah. But by the end becomes sort of fully reconciled, with his Jewish identity. So Feuchtwanger says, in writing this now, as I'm in the Soviet Union, I'm really, deciding between these two options: cosmopolitanism or nationalism, right? And then he sort of picks in favor of not sort of, but he picks in favor of nationalism, right? And this is how he concludes the trilogy, right? Josephus returning to the land of Israel, fully reclaiming his Jewish identity and saying, once I thought that I was the citizen of the world, was the cosmopolitan. And it's before, of course, cosmopolitan becomes such a dirty word in the Stalinist Soviet Union and turned against Jews. So it's before that, right? But Josephus says, once I thought I could be the citizen of the world, and now I realize I'm a Jew, right? So nationalism wins. And it's really, really interesting, right? That again, Feuchtwanger kind of tips the scale in favor of nationalism precisely when he is in the Soviet Union, observing Soviet Jews. So this where you kind of have the complexity of it all, kind of propaganda, right? And cozying up to the tyrant who would turn against Jews, very, 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 very soon. And at the same time, creating this picture of Jewish identity. What I also discovered in doing research, when I was doing research for the book, and it was in Moscow in the archives, letters that were written by readers, and they were encouraged to do so by the authorities, sort of their impressions of the book. And this is when Feuchtwanger was published for the first time in Russia, including the Judean War. And you have these readers, and you can judge if they're Jews or not by the last name, and writing all sorts of things. But then the Jewish readers just like praising the Feuchtwanger to the sky, right? And it's incredible, and emphasizing the Jewish elements, whereas you have some non-Jewish readers saying, why is this published at all? This is some sort of Jewish propaganda, right? So this is where I locate that beginning of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf mentality in that Stalinist period, when Jews are reading themselves, right, through Feuchtwanger, right, and through this act of reading, imaginatively, creatively, right, kind of linking, Josephus's experiences through Feuchtwanger's eyes to what they are, to what they're experiencing, right? So it's this complex kind of network, and then of course each generation would add something else to that. But speaking of nationalism, right, you have articles written when Feuchtwanger is in the Soviet Union in 1937, saying, like there's too much Jewish nationalism in his works, right? Yes, he's sort of, he's within our camp, but he shouldn't be doing that. Yeah. But then it's
And
1960s. Yeah, go ahead.
when were these trilogy published in the Soviet Union? Which years?
When was what published?
The trilogy, the Josephus trilogies. When
So
were
the first two volumes were published in the 1930s, right? And then and the third component just a little bit later. But then, the collected works that come out, that again you would find on so many of these Soviet Jewish bookshelves, that's 1960s. Yeah. And when this is post Six-Day War, right? When there was a project, I also described that in the book. There was a project of publishing kind of retellings of the Hebrew Bible for kids, You know,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
was happening in the 1960s with the help of Kornei Chukovsky, great literary critic, translator, and great children's poet. He wanted to do that. Everything was ready, and then the project was absolute just canceled by the authorities because Six-Day War was happening, and they said you can't, just can't talk about Jerusalem as the Israelis now have occupied the old city of Jerusalem. As this is happening, they're publishing Feuchtwanger, that talks about obviously this ancient Jewish history in Jerusalem. So there are all these paradoxes, which is why, again, we can reduce, the Soviet Jewish story to kind of just these, as you said, stereotypes and these simplifications because they're just not a window onto reality. And then they also don't really show why the Soviet Jewish legacy is relevant today, right? Because, if it's all about stereotypes, then it's just not going to be, that legacy is not going to be effective.
Okay, interesting. We're going to return to like the I'd like to talk to you actually about that Soviet Jewish legacy for today. But so, in addition to Furtwängler, you've got Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, you say, is also a very important writer. Obviously, he is. He's one of the fathers of Yiddish literature with Mendele Moches Forum and Yud Lamed Peretz. And you mentioned that they too were published in translation. Who else would be important for the Soviet Jewish reader? And would it matter? Would it depend on the decade? Now, I know you said you're looking at post-Holocaust, so if you can touch upon that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Great. Another great question. So with Yiddish literature, uh, so on the one hand, you have, and let's start with the kind of the end of your question. So kind of the bulk of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf is formed during the thaw, right? The period, during Nikita Khrushchev's rule, where you have liberalization, where you have attempts to deal to some extent with Stalin's terror, right? And yes, liberalization that leads to cultural revival and renaissance in literature, in arts, in drama, in cinema, right? There are relations now between the Soviet Union and the West, translations of Western and American literature, and rediscovery, republishing of writers who were banned prior to that. Let's say writers like Isaac Babel, who of course a huge part of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, or a number of other figures. And it is also during this period, during the thaw, when after Soviet Yiddish, culture, literature was completely decimated, in the last years of Stalin's rule, you have attempts to now revive it. You have some Yiddish writers who are coming back from the camps, those who have survived, and you have reestablishment of a Soviet Yiddish magazine, right? Sovjetische Heimland, yeah. And so it is during this period that you have these translations, again, translation of Shalom Aleichem, these other classics of Yiddish literature that you mentioned, Model Moher's Forum, Peretz, and then translations, and that would continue, into the 1970s and 80s of contemporary Yiddish literature, right? These contemporary Soviet Yiddish writers who were actively writing and who were actively translating to Russian, into Ukrainian. Yeah. And so you have just tons of this literature. Now, what I argue in my book, based on the kind of evidence that I have, and which has been confirmed by a number of other scholars, is that most of that literature, most of those translations from Yiddish, they were not read. They were not read for a variety of reasons. I
Meaning
think we can,
wait, they were purchased,
they
put
were
on the
purchased,
shelf, but they were not
put on
read.
the shelf for a symbolic value, right?
Interesting.
And the symbolic value was huge because on the cover, it's on the first page, it said "Перевод с еврейского," translated from Jewish. Jewish in this case was Yiddish. That was enough. That was enough to put it there. But then nobody would touch it for a variety of reasons, right? And we can get into that. I think the classics are an exception, especially Sholem Aleichem. He was beloved. He was read. Again, the question that I ask, how was he read? Yeah, it was the kind of the comical Shalom Aleichem, the more serious Shalom Aleichem, the more tragic one, the more nationalist one. Yeah, so we can ask all these questions. So as far as Yiddish is concerned, I mentioned, of course, again the Russian works. Either writers from the 1920s who were revived during the thaw, or the later, right? Again, Ehrenburg is huge here, Vasily Grossman. But then what I'm really also really interested in, and have a chapter, translations from Hebrew. Yeah. So in the 1960s, early 1960s, when there are still diplomatic relations between Israel and the Soviet Union, and actually there's quite a bit of cultural exchange, right? So you have these projects of translating Hebrew-Israeli literature into Russian, publishing it in the Soviet Union, and conversely translating Russian literature into Hebrew, publishing it in Israel. Of course, keeping in mind that some of the luminaries of Israeli Hebrew literature, poets like Leah Goldberg and Shlonsky, they were translators of Russian literature, right? I mean, Goldberg translates, War and Peace. Shlonsky translates Babil and so much more. So you have a number of these collections of Israeli literature, Israeli poetry, Israeli prose, published in the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. Yeah. So again, on the one hand, it's propagandist because if you look at the prefaces, yeah, it certainly, very much presents this Hebrew Israeli literature from a Marxist perspective. But if you look at the content, so there's this really interesting collection that's published, Poets of Israel. It is edited by Boris Slutsky. This is a poet that I wrote a book about. He's this fascinating Soviet Jewish figure. He's an editor of that volume. On the Israeli side, it's Alexander Penn. This is also a really, really interesting poet who's a communist, who grows out of Russian poetry, but who's a Hebrew poet in Israel. And so you look at the content of that volume, and pretty much all the major Israeli poets are represented in it. It also has translations of poets of Arab poets, yeah, Israeli Arab poets, and translations from Yiddish. Yeah, so it kind of presents this rather sort of full, egalitarian picture of Israeli literature. For the purposes of that volume, it is again propagandist, right? And so here you have the product of sort of propaganda on the one hand. On the other hand, a very good mirror representation of Israeli literature, right? There is a volume of Israeli prose where again you have, a story by Shmuel Yosef Agnon, a number again very, very important writers, and who writes a preface writes a preface to that volume, the chief editor of Sovietisch Heimland, Virgelis, right? Who, again, on the one hand, an arm of propaganda, yeah, and everything that comes with that. On the other hand, Virgelis writes about in that preface, the history of Jewish literature, right? That has all of these components, the sacred components, the medieval component, right? The modern component, yeah? And so again, you kind of have this marriage of propaganda on the one hand. On the other hand, some actually pretty accurate and substantial presentation. And so as a reader, within the Soviet environment, what do? You have to read between the lines, right? Nothing can be taken at face value, right? If you take things at face value in the Soviet context, it's not reflective of reality. It's also really boring, right? So here you have to do both. And I write a lot about Virgelis, right? Who again, sort of, definitely part of that propagandist world. How could he not be when he's publishing this, Soviet Yiddish magazine? At the same time, he very much in his own writings, he talks about what he calls the Jewish street. And he visits all these countries in Western Europe, in the United States, and in the Soviet bloc, and he looks for Jewish life in New York, in Paris, in London, in Warsaw, right? In other words, what he is saying is that all of these Jews, they're part of the same nation, right? They're part of the same collective. And that includes Israel as well. That goes very much against, I guess we'll get to that, right? Kind of this anti-Zionist presentation or official Soviet presentation of Jews as, yes, definitely ethnic, an ethnic group, but there is no one large collective. And here comes Vergelis, you know, who says, nope, we're all one, we're all one. Yes, and he says the Soviets, this is where you find true Jewish life, but and so yeah, all of these things are sort of coexisting there.
Coexisting. I understand, but yet, and here's kind of I don't know if that's a challenge, but my presentation to you. And yet you have somebody like a Natan Sharansky who represents this, punishment for being a Zionist, for daring to learn Hebrew, for wanting to emigrate to Israel. How do we contend with that that conflict of you've got a burgeoning of publication of Jewish texts, some of which are overtly nationalistic, where they're teaching, as you say, if their goal is to kind of teach the Jewish Soviet population about their roots, many of them do teach that Jews come from the land of Israel, and that's very interesting. How do I make sense, though, at the end of the day, as I'm writing, let's say I'm writing or I'm teaching, what do I tell then? How do I fit in somebody like a Natan Sharansky in the refusenik movement?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I think one answer is reality is complex, right? No, without discounting the importance of figures like Sharansky or a number of other figures, they were clearly singular individuals, right? That is, what they accomplished was huge in terms of changes, with Soviet policy, allowing Soviet Jews to immigrate. Of course, majority of Soviet Jews opted eventually for leaving the Soviet Union. Majority of Soviet Jews were very clear-sighted about the country that they lived in and what it posed to them, and everything else. However, very few chose the path of direct resistance. Yeah. I mean, majority of people needed to live their lives and and receive education and form families and all of that, right? And so I look at, so let me give you an example. So my latest book, right? So I translated a memoir of my grandfather. My grandfather, he was born in 1926. So just to give an idea of his generation, fought in the war. After that, he enrolls in the Kiev State University and becomes a lawyer. He was a prosecuting attorney, a detective, right? Working for a majority of his career in Soviet Ukraine, and kind of in the peripheral places. And he was very much product of Soviet environment and Soviet education. Well, some kind of unique parts, and but who also had he was a prosecuting attorney, which meant he was a party member. Yeah. Uh, but at the same time, he had a very, very distinct sense of his Jewish identity, right? He had that Soviet Jewish bookshelf where you had Feuchtwanger and other writers. And he needed to figure out how to maintain his dignity and resist anti-Semitism that was thrown into his face pretty much on a daily basis at work and the cases that he worked on, right? And but to do so without, sitting in a solitary confinement for years because you gotta feed your family, right? And I described it's I really recommend the book. It's just a fascinating insight into how an ordinary person who was in a certain position of power, who was part of the system, and at the same time was very sober about what that system represented, yeah, and who had at the same time genuine love for Russian literature and genuine love for Ukraine as a place where he grew up. Well, at the same time, again, being very aware of all the anti-Semitic history, right? And the choices that he made, right? And how he offered resistance. Again, sometimes, that could have meant just being obliteration of his career and all of that, right? But, they're just right. We to sort of appreciate this Soviet Jewish experience as a whole. We need to look at all of these parts, right? But again, somebody like Sharansky, that's a singular case, also because of where he was, in the capital, and his own journey, right? Of course there were other journeys, just like not
What you're saying
those.
is he doesn't represent every Soviet Jew.
Absolutely, he
And also what you're saying, and it's good, I'm getting a little bit more clarity, is just because there was access to all these books and Jews Jews had a civilization, as you said in the beginning. That shouldn't be confused with, they had a paradise on earth in the Soviet Union and everything was great and it was a, saccharine, uh, you know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory Soviet Union experience.
Of course not, right? This was, yeah, I think, sort of Reagan's formulation of it as an evil empire. I think, yeah, I mean, and yes, I mean, we need to rehash Soviet history to, at the same time, it was a complete, especially again, if we look at kind of this post-thaw Soviet Union, it was a complex society. It was a society with rich culture. Yeah. It was a society also where Jews played a very important role.
But you know
Jews
what
were, yeah, go ahead.
I want to say to you, which is something that really just you sparked in me. You said, "Oh, we should examine the legacy of Soviet Jews." Now, I don't know if you knew what I don't know if what I'm going to say is what you meant, but it's as if the Soviet Jews who've now immigrated to the West, to America, who were raised on these books at this bookshelf, are uniquely prepared to deal with the moment, whereas American Jews are not in many ways.
Yeah, yeah. And I think yes, I think yes, again, because of the experience that they, or at least, or again, we need to speak about different generations, right? But the experience that they had, right, where they knew where they were, the kind of country that they lived in. They knew what that country, the threat that it posed to them. I mean, they were, I mean, for lack of sort of insiders, outsiders, right? Because again, right, the Soviet Jews were fully integrated. They were the intelligentsia. They were also heavily, involved in commerce. They were everywhere. They were, think about some of the major, songwriters and actors and
Yes, yes.
directors, right? And comedians. They really were so ubiquitous, in the Soviet Union.
True,
It was the third largest Jewish community in the world,
true,
right?
true.
After the Holocaust. And so yes, all of those components were there. And let me just finish this, right? And of course, some absolutely just wanted to break with all of that Soviet, negotiation and trying to survive and just say enough. If that meant, sitting in a solitary cell, okay, right? Uh, but for a majority, they needed to find other ways. Yeah. And how you got to that point, it was different. It was different path. And I think, yeah, reducing it all to kind of that sort of Cold War story that I think gets reproduced today as well in some, is that, kind of erasure of everything, oppression, and then these select few rise and sort of no, no. It does not correspond to reality. And it also really doesn't, as I say, expose that richness of Soviet Jewish experience that comes into handy what you were saying, right? Why is it that Soviet Jews are really more prepared to kind of confront what is facing Jews today than others?
Yeah, and I think it's not even just about experiencing the anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. It's also, you know, um, I grew up in America. So I came to the United States of America when I was 6 years old. So my parents sent me to a Jewish day school. What was on our shelf? It was not Shalom Aleichem. It was, a lot of Holocaust literature and a lot of Jewish values. Tikkun Olam, Chesed, Tzedek Tirdof. We didn't have a sense of Jewish history of our nation. I think what Leon Furtwanger gave the Soviet Jews was a sense of where they come from, whereas American Jews don't have that same sense, and that's kind of what I meant by having that connection to a text that teaches them who they are and where they come from. I always say this, if I didn't really have parents from this former Soviet Union and was just, attending American Jewish day schools, I'm not really sure I would understand that Jewish people are an ethnicity, that Jewish people come from the land of Israel. I would see us as a religious minority first and foremost. Um,
Yeah.
well, then I really want to talk about anti-Zionism next, but something I want to, not related to your book, but related to Soviet Jewish history is, Stalin wrote an essay in 1913 saying Jews do not constitute a nation, you know. We talked about Furtwängler and the fact that how is it that he's writing these nationalistic works of literature in a climate that's you cannot have Jewish nationalism. Why would the Soviet Union stamp on passport and official documents the Jewish nation? Like, why would they identify Jews as a nation then? What are
Yeah,
your
yeah. Right. So again, I think here, we need to look at sort of the different, we need to look at the changes and the fluctuations. A good actually window into that can these official Soviet definitions of, you know, what Jews, right? What these Jews are is a great Soviet encyclopedia. And you look at different editions, 1930s and, 1950s, 1980s, right? And you can kind of trace these changes. I mean, ultimately leaving kind of Stalin aside, but to the Soviets, Jews were an ethnic group, yeah, but not, in other words, not like a Jew in Moscow is part of the same ethnic group as a Jew in New York, right? So, and that's why then you're opposed to the idea of creating a Jewish state, yeah, because Israel then is trying you to convince that because you are a Jew living in Chernivtsi in Ukraine, you're the same as the Jew from Iraq, right? So to these Soviet ideologues, that's just nonsense, right? So they're an ethnic group. They have their own language, Yiddish, yeah. Uh, and they would, yeah, again, you look at sort of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, an entry on kind of ancient Jewish history. Yes, they talk about, what Palestine or the land of Israel is the birthplace, but then you kind of have this dispersal and all of that, right? So do you see what I mean? They are an ethnic group, which is why, right? Which is why in the Soviet passport it's nationalность, which in the Soviet lingo means ethnicity, right?
Mhm.
So they're designated ethnically as Jews, but they are Soviet citizens. Their allegiance is to the Soviet state. That is why, if you, as a Soviet citizen, say, I would like to leave, then you're seen as a traitor, right? Because you're betraying your allegiance to your Soviet homeland. But otherwise, and in the 1920s or 30s, it would be more genuine. Later, it just becomes a sham. That Jews are part of the Soviet family of ethnicities, of
Right, there
nations.
was something Дружба народов, which is the
Дружба
friendship of
народ.
nations.
Exactly. Right. So again, as I said, kind of this conspicuous aspect of Soviet life is that there is no public space for expressing Jewishness, right? There, unlike with other, where you have Ukrainian schools or Belarusian schools, and of course we can talk about, the oppression, persecution of those ethnicities and cultures as well, right? But it's still different again from the Jewish case where you just kind of have this erasure from this sort of official standpoint, which is why, as I said, and Soviet Jews needed to create these spaces where they could safely where they could safely be who they are. Of course, there is Birobidzhan, but that's because nobody took it seriously, and
Yeah.
that's not a, that's a separate, that's a separate story, right? But that was kind of at the core of sort of official Soviet position, right? Jews are an ethnicity. Again, they got their own language. Although, if you look at, again, if you look at Soviet anti-Zionist literature, it changes. It changes from the early, to something that becomes really kind of ferociously anti-Semitic in the 1980s, where they're even denying that Jews are even an ethnicity. They're even denying the fact that Yiddish is a legitimate language, right? And it's sort of you get there as well. But classically, yes, they're an ethnicity. They can they have their own culture, which is why you can have Sovetish Heimland, which is why you can have Birobidzhan, which is why you can have all of these things. And that's why the Soviets were so on the international scene so adamant. I'm talking about the Soviet regime, so adamant about insisting that, well, of course, Jews have all sorts of rights in the Soviet Union and can, develop their culture, or even, if they want to, they can be religious. I mean, then they're outmoded and et cetera, et cetera. But there is on page there is freedom of religion in the Soviet Union. On page, obviously, the reality is fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different, right? Yeah, I always found that to be just a little bit kind of confusing because, when I think of an ethnicity, ethnic groups have an or they come from a place.
Right.
So it's a little bit, and also as you said, with the Soviet Union, you can never take anything at face value. That's just absolutely wrong. So even when you and I were saying, oh, friendship of nations, that's the official party line. But everybody knew, when you get marked on your passport, or I just recently found out that in teacher school rosters, they had also the ethnicity of the students in
Right.
the, so, and this was a way to mark, from what I understand, this was a way to mark as not as- yes, Soviet, but not really.
Right, of course. And it meant, again, we're talking about Soviet anti-Semitism, right? Which was systemic and which meant, again, depending on the period we're talking about, but it meant not having real, mobility at work,
Yeah.
not being admitted, I mean, certainly quotas or having universities where just Jews would not be admitted at all. I mean, again, it was part of life. And so one had to work with it. One had to work with it without, yeah, yeah.
Let's
And yeah.
let's move in your chapter called The Bottom Shelf. I
Hmm.
just which has to do with anti-Zionism. And there's it's people are speaking about it more and more today. So let's kind of fill in the gaps of Soviet anti-Zionism. And I'm just going to read, I think it's just important for the viewers and listeners to know this information. You write that from the 60s, the 1960s, and especially after the Six Day War, 67, there was an enormous output of anti Zionist and anti Israeli writing in the Soviet Union and countries of the Soviet bloc. More than 400 books, pamphlets, and brochures were published with a total print number run of 15 million copies. The Soviet regime succeeded in creating an anti Zionist pseudoscience. So, would you say then, as an expert on Soviet Jewish history and literature, that this begins a different period in the history of Soviet, not Jewish identity, but Soviet anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, yeah. Right. You look at some of the, let's say, scholarly, books about Israel published in the 1950s. Uh, and they're critical of Israel, uh, but it's all within, I mean, it's within the norm, right? They're still, they're providing rather accurate information about economy, or even if you look, I talk about that at length, this first travelogue, Soviet travelogue to Israel, written by, again, it's just on the one hand kind of pure propaganda. On the other hand, it also has some really kind of interesting tidbits about Hebrew literature and fascinatingly includes a whole section about the Holocaust and Kiev and Babi Yar, right? Babin Yar, the place where majority of Kiev's Jews were massacred by the Nazis and their accomplices, where famously there was not a monument put up by the regime. So within this travelogue, published in the mid 1950s, that talks about Israel being the lackey of the West, there's a section devoted to that, the absence of that monument at Babin Yar. So again, it just shows you how just what a fascinating animal sort of we're dealing with, right? And this writer, who again was making sure that he would follow the line, but he includes this section, which again any Soviet Jewish reader would understand what he is talking about, the absence of that monument, and he could only do so precisely because it isn't a book about Israel. Do you see what I mean? It just again shows what a kind
But
of complex but as yes, after the Six-Day War, when is
Russian Zionism, you've got fascism under the Blue Star, you've got well, Judaism without embellishments is before.
which is early, right?
Earlier. But just for I found this very interesting. I just want to read this out loud. That for you, you read this book, Judaism Without Embellishments, when you were in the fifth and sixth grade, and you went and you threw it out. You tore it apart. You threw it out, and your friends who were Jewish said, "But why?" There was some because there was some
Because
information about Israel there.
that's right, yeah. Or even more generally, more general about Judaism, right? So again, right, so yes, after the Six-Day War, when you have this kind of Soviet Union becomes very much sees Israel as, as the enemy, it begins to equate Zionism and Nazism, right? And as the result of that, on the one hand, there is this just enhancement of anti-Semitism in general in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Soviet Jews, it is a moment when they feel there's a sense of revival and pride in being who they are, but not just to them, right? Despite again all this kind of official antagonism toward Israel, widely, at least among the intelligentsia, there's a great deal of solidarity with Israel, not on the part of Jews, but on the part of everybody, right? And famously, there was a saying in the Soviet Union after the Six-Day War. So there's the anti-Semitic Russian expression, "Bей Жидов," strike the Jews, beat up kikes, right? Beat up Jews. But now it was reversed. Not beat up Jews, but beat up like the Jews do, right? So there's this sense, look at what Israel accomplished. Again, not just on the part of Jews, but on the part of others as well. And actually, the fact that now the state so fully opposes Israel, that was only an indication, at least again to those among the intelligentsia, that you should sympathize with Israel, right? Precisely because the state is antagonistic toward it. But what is so fascinating about all this literature, anti-Zionist literature, let's call it that, right? That was produced, is that Soviet Jews consumed it, meaning that you would find it on so many Soviet Jewish bookshelves, right? Why? Some would buy it. Some of the famous cases where they would just buy it and burn it, right? And just destroy it. Uh, but in many, many cases, you would just read it again by not even so much between the lines, by crossing out the lines, right? So I give this example, and there were so many of those examples. And this comes from a father of my close friend who now lives in Israel. They were also from Ukraine. And so he bought this book about the Israeli army. His father bought this book about the Israeli army. And in the 1970s, when he was already a college student, and so on the one hand, the book was about, the evil Israeli army. On the other hand, it talked about all the wars and all the victories and the equipment. And at the back of the book, there were actually Hebrew terms for the military insignia and all of that. And he just devoured that book, right? And that book, produced by Soviet propaganda with the aim of teaching you about the evils of Israeli army, did so much to bolster his sense of pride, sense of Jewish identity, and solidarity with Israel. And also, by the way, after reading that book and having all of that bolstered, he didn't become a Zionist, standing and saying, "Put me in a solitary confinement." No, he continued to lead his life, and left the Soviet Union only in the 1990s, right? Which again shows the reality. The reality is complex, right? The example that you gave of this horrific volume, right, published in Ukraine in 1963, I think, by Kichko, Judaism без прикрас, so, Judaism without embellishments, which was is this presentation of Judaism as this sort of horrible, evil religion, and et cetera, et cetera. So a friend of mine who was a fellow Jew, he said, look what I found, like on the bottom shelf in my grandma's apartment. And he gave me this book. And so I read it from beginning to end. And I was just disgusted. Not because, again, I didn't know much, right? I didn't know much, but I just felt like that everything that it said was either lies or so just malicious, toward Jews and Judaism. And so, having read it from beginning to end, I just tore it. And it was the only case in my life when I did that to a book. And I just threw it out. And now I really regret it because to buy that book, it's like $600 and it's impossible to find. So a few days later, this friend of mine who now lives in the United States also, he said, "Give it back to me." And I said, "You know what? I don't have it. I destroyed it." And he said, "How could you have done that? It was a Jewish book, right?" And I actually, even within that, just horrible, horrible, book written with a clear anti-Semitic intent, which is why the Soviets, just recalled it and all of that. But yes, at the same, even within that book, you could learn a thing or two, right? You could learn a thing or two, which shows, I don't know how that translates directly into American context today. It doesn't, because the contexts are so different. But what it shows, just the imagination and kind of these unique strategies, right, that Soviet Jews came up with to counteract what the state was feeding them in the image that the state presented, right? It was covert, it was cautious, right? But strangely, this literature that was supposed to teach how to either hate Judaism, right, or that Israel is this evil state, it actually only bolstered their sense of who they were in many cases. Again, I'm not saying that was sort of true. That was sort of true in every case, and I'm not advocating, obviously, for publishing this sort of literature, right? But I'm saying context is important because we're dealing with an authoritarian context, right? Where any word that had the word Jewish in it was just seized upon by that Jewish reader, right? You took it
They were
and
so
you started
hungry for it.
were so hungry, you took it and you started working with it. But what it did teach them is that, yes, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right?
But,
And
but I mean, just as I'm speaking with you, the more that you say this, the more that I'm learning and the book that I've read and speaking to you, your book is it is repressive if you're a Jew
yes,
living in an authoritarian regime where you're longing for Judaism, it's is so great that you're going to take an anti-Semitic text, like let's say Mein Kampf, and
yeah. Well, it didn't go
devour
that far, right? Right. Well,
devour
because you can't see, but right, because you can't do that with Mein Kampf, right? You cannot cross out lines. You can't do right there.
Right.
Obviously,
There's actually your no. Hitler writes that that Jews are actually from Palestine, and that there are elements in Mein Kampf which I recently started to read, by the way, just because I wanted to understand better, and I
yeah,
was floored because there are moments where you're like, he's a Zionist. I mean, I'm being cheeky here, but my point to you is that that is sort of very, very repressive if your only access to who you are has to go from an abusive text like that.
right. Which is why, again, I think this idea of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf is useful because, as I said, it has layers, right? There is the front and center where you have your Sholem Aleichem and you have your Feuchtwanger and you have your Babel and you have your Grossman and you have your Ehrenburg next to Pushkin and next to Dostoevsky, another great writer and ferocious anti-Semite, and next to whoever else. And then you have your bottom shelf where these books are hidden deep, 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 and you don't show them to anybody, right? And so the layers are important, right? Which is why, for instance, great writer Friedrich Gorenstein, who's just now beginning to be translated into English. Fascinating writer, could not get published in the Soviet Union, eventually immigrated to Germany. Um, and uh, and so if you look at the depiction of Jews, Soviet Jews in his works, he really he's closer to what you're describing, right? Precisely because you live within this environment, you sort of imbibe this sense of yourself as a slave, right? And he said we never we still carry those cauldrons of slavery that we have back from Egypt, right? So and so that's what he kind of zeroes in on, right? And within his kind of almost prophetic fervor.
Yes.
So of course, again, we're dealing with a country that was not a piece of cake. At the same time, again, what I am really interested in is kind of is these imaginative ways where you do cautiously but subversively, you turn that oppression into something else. Let me give you just one last example, and this is just something recently. So, uh, there was this fascinating medical doctor in Leningrad, a scientist. Salavier was his last name. Very prominent scientist who was also a rabbi, and who, working as a medical scientist, in 60s, 70s. On the one hand, at home, he was writing Hidushim commentaries, Talmudic commentaries. He's an incredibly learned person, right? But who led this double life, and now there's a book published about him and a collection of his rabbinic commentaries. And I talked to his grandson, who published this book, and we talked about the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. And he said, "Oh, absolutely. Let me send you a few pictures of our Soviet Jewish bookshelf." And he sends me that picture. And guess what he has on that bookshelf? All of that anti-Zionist literature, right? So here you have just somebody who, first of all, not just knew what it means, sort of knew, was sure in his Jewishness, but somebody who was actually incredibly educated, right? But who also had all of these volumes that again he would put to this use, right? You go to the remaining Russian bookstores in Israel. There was one, at the Tachana Merkazit in Tel Aviv, that monstrosity, right? And I don't know if that still exists, but I was there a few years ago. That bookstore, Russian bookstore, secondhand bookstore, that is just filled with this anti-Zionist literature, right? And or literature about Judaism, again written from this Marxist perspective, which means that these volumes were actually brought. Soviet Jews brought them to Israel. And maybe part of that was some sort of that sick, like, let me just sort of immerse myself in all that. But part of that, yeah, was just let me learn. Let me put that to good use. And I had copies of these books where literally you have like lines crossed out. Yeah. And what remains are facts. And those facts presented, an image of Israel that was, first of all, very strong. Yeah. You can talk about victories and all of that. I was just thinking, about our conversation. And I had, like people of my generation would know, it's just a few volumes of children's encyclopedia, Soviet children's encyclopedia, where there were entries about different countries. And there was an entry about Israel, and I was, I guess, I don't know, 11, 12, already beginning to be really fascinated with all this stuff. And I just remember like 4 hours, I would just stare at that short entry on Israel because it had a picture, a street in Tel Aviv. And it just showed it as this it was a gray picture, sort of dark place. But I would just stare at it for hours, right? And what it did to me, again, it didn't make me go and say, ha, 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 I'm against the regime. But it absolutely made me, in a sense, fall in love with that place without having seen that place, right? And so, again, contexts are different, right? Contexts are different. But in a sense, because of all of that, when it comes to what we're facing today on our campuses and everywhere else, is the Soviet Jews and the children of Soviet Jews who can just very easily identify what it is, easier than others. And strangely, kind of all that context that we're discussing, I think, kind of prepared them, for that.
Do you think a lot of, I asked you this question. There's a lot of people writing about anti-Zionism, including myself. I'll put myself in that camp as well.
And you do a great job. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Um, what people are saying, myself included, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of the statements that are being circulated are basically straight from this Soviet anti-Zionist playbook. Like until recently, I didn't realize that the slogan "Zionism is racism" was coined by this guy named Primakov, then goes to the UN in 1975.
Right.
I have a question for you. Do you think that what was the Union doing? Like, were they really just wanting to go after Jews? Like, why were they going after Israel like that? What was their purpose?
No, great question. I should preface it by saying, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not but obviously thought a lot about these things. Well, of course, yeah. A lot of this of what we're seeing today, it comes from the left, although it now migrates to the right, and right, we now have a nice little sort of union of the two when it comes to Israel. But it comes from the leftist playbook, where of course the Soviet Union played a huge part, right? I mean, I did a little study and what was going to write about that. But you look at the publications in the United States, in the 70s, published by folks associated with the American Communist Party, and the books that they published about Israel, and those are just taken directly from the Soviet playbook. And obviously, the Soviets were very much in control of what the communist parties in the West were doing. Again, how much impact that had on the larger scene, I don't know.
But
I
why
don't
were
know.
they doing this? Why was the Soviet Union going
Why?
after? So it was such a
I mean, of course, I mean, on the one hand, it was part of Cold War strategy, right? And all of that. But I think we should also keep in mind Soviet Union was incredibly inept and did things that made no sense and were horribly stupid. That's why, when we talk about, yes, they created sort of this idea of anti-Zionism as a science, but they were inept in how, they were not kind of this super efficient sort of machine that did all of that. And you mentioned somebody like Primakov, for instance, right? Who was an important part of Soviet, foreign ministry, and especially responsible for the Middle East, and he was one of those people who was arguing already back in the 70s, we need to have a rapprochement with Israel. There were secret negotiations conducted between him and the Israelis. So what was happening behind the scenes was at times different from, again, what was happening up front. Yeah. But it's messy. And yes, of course, it was connected to Soviet internal attitude toward Jews, right? I mean, fears that Jews would immigrate, and fears that, and just the remainder of kind of that of traditional, Russian anti-Semitism of the Russian state. So all of these components, but a lot, again, we're dealing with a country that was and a regime that was inept in terms of what it was doing, and the stupid decisions that it made.
Yeah, but for an inept regime, look at how successful, I mean, look at what is happening in the United States of America. I mean, I've been studying this a lot. I think that they weren't so inept in many ways. I think that they scanned the globe, and they understood that they're going to invest in third world places, this global south, the African continent, um, and Arab world. And they identified these groups, and they shipped the communism, this particular Marxist language, and gave them the language to see themselves as oppressed by the West, by America. So I do agree with you. This is part of the Cold War story, that this is a story to malign America and the West through Israel. But I guess I would question this idea that you're right. Like, they did a lot of foolish things if we really like kind of peel back and study. But look at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the same, in many ways similar, a situation playing out in spaces like K through 12, higher education, medical schools even.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I don't know how much, yes, sort of ultimately it is part of that leftist playbook, but how much Soviet Union directly has to do. A lot of what we're seeing today is the result of internal American politics and developments, right? I mean, I used to, yes, kind of confronting all of this on my campus, other campuses, I would say, a lot of what you're sort of repeating was kind of, created in the hallways of KGB. And people looked at me like, really? Wow, I didn't realize that, right? So, uh, I guess in some broader sense, we have it as absolutely traceable to the Soviet Union. More directly, I'm not sure, which is also, I think, why kind of former Soviet Jews in the United States are exposed to all of this. They're like, really? Like we mocked this stuff in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, yeah, as you write yourself, right? Like your mother, right, had to sit through these, political meetings where, you had to get up and condemn the Israeli aggression and all of that. And, you would internally laugh at it and because it was just part of this daily propaganda that surrounded you, and you knew that it was completely idiotic, right? And here it's actually taken seriously. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's no direct line, at least to kind of this current political moment that we're in. Um, I don't know. You look at somebody like, let's say, Edward Said, right, who is certainly the intellectual father of a lot of this. How much was he influenced by specifically sort of the Soviet? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there are other entries into all of this, right? And of course, yes, it is part of this leftist politics that dominate U.S. campuses to the complete exclusion of everything else. Although maybe that's beginning to change. But um, but it's more it's more complex than that. Not to, of course, forget the fact that during Perestroika, Gorbachev's reforms. I mean, there was genuine change in policy toward Israel on the part of the Soviet Union. Yes, and quite and very very different relations, right? And even and I mean, the current, obviously, Russian politics. That's a different story, right? But even today, right? I mean, like the Israeli government has a hard time of fully, becoming fully antagonistic toward Russia and separating yourself. The Soviet
Saying
story
that,
sort of
saying
ends
that,
at a certain point. It
right.
becomes something different.
That's true. Agreed. I just think that the 1960s, 70s authors, the pseudoscientists and Zionologists, or they come the Zionologists, they were anti-Zionists. I think they cast a far shadow. Like, for instance, I recently, I had a young journalist on my show, Sam Hyde, who's from South Africa and has been studying the Soviet influence on South Africa. And we
Yeah,
were talking, and he said, well, during apartheid South Africa, they couldn't go to school in South Africa, the black. So they went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union saw this as a beautiful opportunity.
yeah,
And so to bring their ideology. And so he said to me, in South Africa, the major party there feels extremely loyal. They have this loyalty to this Soviet Union who is supporting them in their struggle against oppression.
yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
no, I think that's absolutely right. And again, this third world is, I forget who wrote it, but there was a piece written after Mamdani's victory, and that very much talks about Mamdani as precisely like his type of socialism is very different from like socialism that you have, let's say, in certain Western European countries, right? It is part of the kind of third worldism, and that it struck me that way too. Uh, but again, when we talk at the case of when we look at the United States, it is like United States had its own sort of a lot of its own stuff that contributed that contributed to that. Yeah.
as we're wrapping up, something else made me think, in your work of kind of rescuing Jewish civilization in the Soviet Union and saying that it's a little bit more complicated than a stereotype. I always wonder, how will a historian capture this moment that we're living in? And let's say they would write about this repressive American colleges where Jewish kids have to, basically pledge their loyalty to participating in college life by denouncing their Zionism. And then there would be somebody else, but you know what? They went to Chabad and there was a Chabad on campus and they had Shabbat life and right. So I guess what you're saying is two things can be simultaneously.
Of course, of course. Yeah. I mean, not to minimize, and I've been at the front lines of this and in the throes of all this again on my own campus. And so I don't want to minimize the importance of the moment that we're in. But yeah, the reality is complex. I was just thinking, I live in Portland, Oregon, which is a extremely progressive place. And but that has a robust Jewish community. I think most of them would see themselves as sort of on the center left or so. But for years in our Jewish day school, the only Jewish school in town, where I send my kids, eighth graders go to Israel. And that's been happening for decades, right? and they stopped after October 7th, for security reasons. And this year they're going again. And I remember when my son was in eighth grade, just I guess 2 years ago now, 3 years ago. And so his class, they went on a trip to Israel for 2 weeks, and we were in the airport, and the principal of the school, she said to these eighth graders, she said, "You're going to your homeland," right? So, it's a Zionist school. Well, at the same time, it is also, we're in a very, again, progressive place, everything that means. So the reality is complex, right? I mean, I agree with you that kind of that sense of nationhood, right? And being part of that collective. I think maybe it needs to be bolstered, and we can think about how, and yeah. But at the same time, I think that connection to Israel, uh, that many, many, many American Jews have. They have it, and it's not going away. And a lot of them need to negotiate now how to reconcile where they see themselves politically in the United States to in terms of their relationship with Israel, right? But that component is there, yeah. And so, I know you work so hard on Jewish education, and I think it's very, very important to talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But I think you would agree with me. I think it's also really, really important to talk about the positive, right?
Absolutely.
And to look at the curricula in these Jewish day schools. How about reading Bialik? How about reading Hebrew literature? How about actually talking about Zionism, not only through, again, this sort of literature that depicts it in these negative terms, but returning to Zionist philosophers. For me, it's always Jabotinsky, and introducing that into the discourse, right? Because interestingly, what those again, people like Jabotinsky, who very much was a cosmopolitan on the one hand, and on the other hand, a dedicated Jewish
Yes.
nationalist, it
Yes.
speaks to the moment that we're also in. So I think reality is complex, and that's just the way it is.
Well, I want to thank you for writing this book, because I don't know, reading it made me just smile because it made sense of my story, my family story, and how my mother loved certain books and my grandfather loved certain books, and then why did my Russian friends' parents have the same books? And just thinking about the bookshelf again as this, as I said in the beginning, almost like a synagogue of sorts.
Yeah.
Um, as we wrap up, what is your next project that you're working on, if you want to tell us?
Yeah, so my next project, in a sense, it's an extension of this one. And so I'm writing a book about science fiction in the Soviet Union, and a bit broader in the Soviet bloc, primarily in Poland. And what I argue in that book is that science fiction that was huge, in the Soviet Union again during the stop period and beyond. It was a Jewish space. It was a Jewish space, not just because so many of the major writers were Jewish and Jewish readers gravitated toward it, but because it was also a place where Jewishness was explored in so many fascinating ways, often kind of between the lines, but also explicitly, also unambiguously, right? And so sci-fi, yeah, became that space where again, kind of this Soviet Jewish civilization, was worked out. And apart from Jewishness, these are just incredible texts that are so relevant, like for those who love, Marvel Universe and just love sci-fi. These texts are incredible.
Are they
Either
written by Jewish writers or
right, so many of them were like some of the major sci-fi writers were Jewish. I talk a lot about Stanislav Lem, who was one of the great sci-fi writers in the 20th century. In general, Polish Jew, where Jewishness is so fascinating in his work, Holocaust Survivor, or the Strugatsky brothers, about whom I have already written in this book, and so many others, right? So kind of sci-fi was that, yeah, it was the kind of, I call it Jewish artistic form. Jewish space. So very much part of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, very much part of the general Soviet Soviet bookshelf. That again shows kind of the richness and the complexity. Yeah, but it's a definite addendum to I think the canon of Jewish literature in the 20th century. Yeah, so that's what I'm working on now.
So you're always working really within Soviet Jewish history and literature in many ways.
In many ways, although, I mean, more, when I work on cinema, it's more kind of global Jewish cinema,
Mm.
French American, um, but yeah, yeah, yeah. But again, situating all of that within a larger kind of Jewish cultural and textual universe. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on Don't
Thank
Know
you.
Enough. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this episode. On our next episode, we are going to be speaking with some legal luminaries to discuss Title VI laws, and laws in Canada around hate speech. So stay tuned for that.
Don't know much about history.